We're here to discuss the second episode of It's a Sin, Russell T Davies' 2021 series following the lives of a group of young people in the 1980s as the AIDS epidemic in the UK came to a terrifying and tragic zenith in London. As with our previous discussion on the first episode of It's a Sin, the bulk of this discussion will just cover the second episode in terms of, well, the second episode, with no spoilers for further episodes in the series, but towards the end we'll have a clearly marked transition and move into a Sin spoiler zone, where we discuss episode 2 in context of and with spoilers for all 5 episodes of the series, for those that have already seen the whole thing. So, discussing episode 2, our episode mostly set in 1984, will be myself, Neo from Australia, joined by Ingiga from England and Tomtit from Australia. What did you guys think of the second episode?
I loved it. I enjoyed it much more than the first episode, in fact. I pretty much devoured every frame of it from start to front. I felt it was really ratcheting up and getting into its stride. I just thought it was great.
I guess, well, first of all, I think that this series doesn't have any weak episodes, and for a 5-episode series, I think it can't really afford to. But if I had to pick an episode which maybe isn't as much of a tour de force as some of the other episodes and is maybe doing more heavy lifting for the plot, I would say it's probably this episode.
Yeah.
It's not bad drama by any means. In fact, it's really, really good drama. It's just, it feels more technical than some of the other episodes. I also think this episode, more than any of the other ones, is sort of a tribute to Larry Kramer, who wrote that play The Normal Heart, which is one of the most famous AIDS dramas. I think this is reconstituting a lot of what was in that play. And so in that sense, I feel like RTD is maybe consciously trying not to repeat things that he said while also sort of revising some of the important points that he raised. But yeah, still a great episode by all means.
Gig, what worked for you really well in this episode?
I think I felt what stuck out the most was just that it was able to move from device to device with complete seamlessness, complete confidence. For example, the way in which it used those duets between Richie and Jill as kind of the spine of the episode, while being able to layer in thematically relevant stuff over each one. I love that one where Jill is working herself to the bone caring for Gloria, while the song in the background is a bit tonally dissonant, but kind of reflecting that theme of kind of giving so much and not receiving anything in return. And I loved how it was able to move from stuff like Richie's monologue to the camera, and then just the way in which the whole episode was kind of brought together with the story of Gloria from the kind of the start to the end. I felt, well, I agree with Tomtit, it was definitely one of those episodes that's more kind of the show in sort of a, not a holding pattern, but sort of in a normal mode rather than a peak. But I felt that I really love when a show can do that really well and just kind of do its thing, but do it in a way that shows extreme skill and a complete grasp on what its thing is. I think, basically, I just felt it just came together very well.
I would agree with that.
What did we think of Gloria's story in this episode? Gloria is, of course, the friend of the main gang that's a bit older than the rest of them.
I thought it felt really, really sudden, and there was sort of a mix of very unusual emotions going on because of the reactions of the main gang. They sort of dismiss it a little bit, we didn't know him that well. All of the sort of just the whole trend of trying to sweep it under the rug and his own sort of denial and anxiety about it. It was very sort of muted in that way, whereas, for example, the death of Mr. Coltrane in the first episode felt kind of momentous. This one is more sort of just disquieting in how quick it all happens, for me anyway. I felt that Gloria, I think, maybe lacked to a slight degree the internality that some of the other characters have. I think that he starts out as being a very comic relief character. He's sort of just the one that the gang carries around and makes sort of funny comments now and then all of a sudden it's he's expiring. So in that sense it's very uncomfortable.
I thought in terms of the guys kind of dismissing Gloria, I thought what really stuck out, especially on a rewatch, is that it's how cruel it is. Like, you know, early on in the episode, Gloria's driving Roscoe to kind of spy on his sister's wedding and stuff, and it's like, and then by the end of the episode, Roscoe has just completely like obliviated Gloria, like just, oh well, you know, he's left, he doesn't matter anymore, and it just the callousness of it really stuck out, because I think it emphasises the degree to which the other characters kind of find kind of deep attachments, sort of like they kind of reject kind of being too invested to protect themselves. I think it was quite interesting. I think I agree. Like Gloria, he's more in this episode more of kind of a device for RTD to kind of introduce some of those classic horror techniques, like that monologue he has where he describes his visit to the doctors and how they asked him if he'd had sex with animals. I think it's kind of that very recognisable thing with RTD where some small detail comes out, and that in turn sort of is kind of the most horrific thing, the very scary thing. And, you know, and as a character is maybe talking and they're trying to kind of keep their lid on, but that small detail comes out and then they're sort of breaking down. I was thinking it's quite interesting, and I agree, he's kind of kept to the edges, and even, you know, we don't actually see him die or anything like that, you know, and at the very final scene he's already gone, and we just see his family sort of burning any trace of him. And I suppose the whole thing with this episode is that there's a huge focus on stuff that people aren't saying, rather than putting the important stuff front and centre, which I think runs throughout the whole thing.
That part where he says he doesn't want to be seen as a slut, that was really confronting, because like it's not only that he doesn't want to be seen as gay, like to his family, but even within his gay community friends, he doesn't want to be seen as overly promiscuous or anything. It's like there's so many layers going on there.
In our discussion of episode 1, we tried to unpack any possible metaphors in the dialogue that opened the show. I think a much easier exercise for this episode might be, what's the pink mug that Gloria drinks from represent? What's going on symbolically with the pink mug that the Pink Palace is named after?
I guess because it's the pink mug that Jill suddenly, you know, is very, very afraid of, because it's been sort of infected, if you like, potentially by Gloria, I guess. And the fact it's sort of the pink one that was previously symbolic of, you know, their campness and their gayness, I guess it's maybe like the idea of the stigma of shame and fear sort of infecting what was supposed to be something empowering and positive for them, I guess.
Yeah. What do you think, Tom?
I think it's kind of a few things. Like I read it sort of primarily as like the honeymoon phase of these people's lives is coming to an abrupt end. So it's like their sort of free-spirited adolescence is tragically cut short because of this like horrible danger that's come in. And on a larger scale, it's sort of like in the wake of the whole sexual revolution and everything that the gay community fought for, it's like that's been set back now. And so the pink mug is kind of a representation of, you know, all that stuff.
Our beloved showrunner, Russell T Davies, his take with the pink mug was not something I intuited from the episode. In an interview with The Big Issue, he said, in those days, the 80s, people were scared of taking a sip from a cup someone with HIV had drunk from. Those scared people are always portrayed as the villains, as homophobic, so I wanted to swing that round and show one of our heroes being terrified of a mug. Jill can't let it go, she washes it, she cleans it, she hides it, she goes to bed thinking about it, she gets up to put it in the bin, then takes it out of the bin and smashes and puts it back in the bin, and that is a character we love. So he was trying to kind of like humanize this homophobic or like villainous view of people had, like anything that's been touched by someone with HIV is infected and disgusting and must be destroyed, like we see in the ending sequence. I didn't get that at all from the pink mug scene, like humanizing, just because I don't perceive Jill as like villainous at all. But I thought that was an interesting take that RTD was doing. What do you guys think of that?
I think it definitely shows how that fear of the risk and stuff, and how not really necessarily knowing all the scientific facts, it was something that was pretty much universal rather than unique to homophobes or whatever, because Jill is clearly just, you know, she lives in a house with all these people, she's trying to protect everyone, right? She's scared for everyone. She's not just like, oh how disgusting, I don't want to be infected. She's trying to ensure the safety of pretty much herself and everyone around her. So So I think it comes very naturally. I think maybe not the most obvious thing that RTD was doing, but I think subtly, I think he achieved what he was going for more or less, even if it's not explicit.
I'm quite surprised to hear what that quote from RTD, just because, like, I guess not even doctors knew really what was going on back then. So, like, the idea that you could ever be too careful back then is slightly, strange. And that's probably also very much, like, to do with living in a post-COVID world, like the idea of, you can never be too careful. But, I mean, the whole added layer of Jill being a straight woman or a bisexual woman, it's not exactly clear. But her having a degree of separation from the gay community definitely adds another layer of drama, because it's like she runs the risk of representing just the repressive het orthodoxy, when obviously all she wants is for her friends to be safe.
I guess that's kind of muted by the fact we get that long montage Gig was talking about of Jill caring for Gloria. So she's so obviously not disgusted with Gloria. She's so obviously caring and nurturing of Gloria that it's hard to kind of perceive the mug destruction as like as something born of disgust. It's so much clear. It feels to me just like it's born of care and worry for the men she's living with, wanting them to be safe, like how she cautions them later in the episode. But it's always interesting to hear when the writer is maybe going for something different than people pick up. Do we want to talk about Jill more?
Yeah, that's really what I was going to go into. Like, the positioning of Jill in this episode was really interesting because it's, like you say, it's because she has that degree of separation that she's chosen by Gloria to be the one who has to hold on to his secret, pretty much, and do all this both emotional and physical labour on his behalf, because he's kind of scared to go out and kind of do stuff. And that sort of is kind of interesting, because she's kind of getting the short end of the stick, and she's and that scene where he comes in, he's acting like everything's fine with all the other guys, and she's just standing there, like, just not saying anything, but quietly internally she's like screaming, like, ah, like it really shows how, just as trying to be a friend to all of these guys, she's maybe being slightly almost taken advantage of a little bit. And I thought it was really interesting, because obviously Lydia West is fantastic, and I think I liked having Jill as more of a focal point and viewpoint character in this episode. And there was those scenes where I think multiple points in that initial conversation where Gloria kind of reveals what's going on to her, where she's not saying anything, but she's looking at the camera, and she has to do a lot of work with just her facial expression and lots of emotional changes going through in the space of a few seconds. She's really, really impressive.
How far do I want to take this? But with Jill, so she's very nurturing, as we were saying.
You're the mother of the show. You really are, and the warmth that you bring to that character, it's beautiful. And your character is based on a real person. Jill Nalder, is that how it's pronounced? Yeah, Nalder. Did you have an opportunity to talk to her before you started filming?
I did. So Russell told me the day before the read-through that the real life, well, Jill is based very loosely on a real life character called Jill, and so much so that he didn't change her name, and she'll be playing my mother. And I was like, oh my god.
What would that be like for an actor?
I guess maybe the pressure's on slightly, realising that, oh shit, there's a real person that I'm portraying, and also I'm going to meet them.
I can't imagine. But yeah, so she's very maternal, she's very nurturing. The words Russell uses to describe her, and remember, it's kind of confusing because he's describing a character that Lydia West is playing, but he's also describing his real life friend, who's, basically right there. She's in the show, she's still his friend. So when he describes Jill, it's like these compliments are going in multiple directions. All that stuff's great. She's the heart of the boys' friendship circle. Russell has said Jill is better than me as a person because she went to the hospital wards and held the hands of men who were dying. Russell says he did a bit of that, but Jill, the real Jill, dedicated her life to it. What do you guys think Jill is getting out of her relationship with the other boys, Richie in particular? What do you think's going on there? We know what Valerie thinks, Richie's mother, because she says it in the episode.
I saw you singing a love song. I know it's acting. Well, I'm hardly an expert, but from the little I can gather, good acting is when it's true. It's me.
But what do you two think?
Okay, well, there's so many different ways you could go with this. I think on a very basic level, caring for other people makes you feel good. That's an innocent explanation, and it's one that I subscribe to. I guess you could bring in like a bunch of other contributing factors to that, like a sort of gratification or a feeling of power that like you have a high ground over these people. But like, I don't really care about that. It's like if you get positive feelings from helping other people, then that's good. That's kind of where I stand on it. I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm interested to see where you're going to go with this.
I mean, I think, like, Jill, clearly, she's part of a community with these guys, as we saw in episode 1. Like, she's really happy with them. She, there's a mutual friendship. They have tons of fun, and, she's embedded in that group. And, I guess they have sort of share that emotional bond. And I think it seems natural to me. I don't really view her as like self-righteous or setting herself up as like the angelic, like mother saintly figure or whatever. Like, and hell, in this episode, she's not really, she's asked to do all this stuff. She's kind of taking it upon herself, like for Gloria. She's not like arrogantly putting herself in this position. She's kind of being asked to do this stuff, and she's doing it because she's sort of very willing to give a lot. And I think, certainly at this point, I don't really view her as kind of self-righteous or looking to set herself up as some god figure. I think she's just, at the end of the day, I think she's just doing something good because it's right, because it's kind, to quote Doctor Who for a moment.
And she's also not just interested in her circle of friends, like she's interested in raising awareness in general about AIDS.
That's the end of the episode where she sits with the guys who pass out the flyers.
Yeah, and even throughout the episode, when she asks Colin to kind of do the research and stuff, interestingly, what stuck out there is that she kind of reminded me of maybe not just like necessarily one RTD character or another, but like, I guess there's kind of a thing in RTD shows, maybe here and there, where one character will voice their frustration that no one's doing anything. Because this idea of a single figure against a complacent world or society, like I'm reminded of Rose in Parting of the Ways when she's like, oh, you take a stand, you say no, or like when you have a character maybe like Gwen Cooper trying to investigate what's going on with Torchwood and stuff in the first episode, and also of course Years and Years a bit that comes in with the big monologue you guys hated from for the final episode, but this idea of a single person trying to be the one person doing the right thing where everyone else is just letting it go under the rug, that came through a lot with when Jill's asking Colin to kind of, there's this disease going around and no one knows anything, no one's doing anything, so please help, but let's try and figure out what's going on. And I think that dynamic of a character trying to solve this mystery helps maybe, I don't know, animate the story a little bit, and it kind of locates her as kind of a bit of a protagonist role maybe.
Yeah.
It's Larry Kramer coming in again, because the protagonist of The Normal Heart, Jill, is basically filling that role that the character in The Normal Heart does. That play is all about like militancy and active direct action versus sort of complacency. And I read Jill as sort of a tribute to that character. And also, like, in a weird way, she's a bit of a author insert.
Yeah.
She's almost embodying like RTD, what he's like now with the benefit of hindsight, while also obviously being of someone who he knew. So it's a weird amalgamation of like his view now and the person he knew then. And she's a bit of a composite.
Russell's a time travel writer, so I think it kind of fits for him to write a character who can retroactively have a clearer read on the situation than others might have in the 80s. But also Jill was real, so it's all a mash of things, like you say. I think one of the reasons he might not have communicated to Lydia West, the actress, until the 11th hour that she's playing someone based on a real person is because I think it would be much easier to play someone more simply if you were trying to live up to someone real, like a real activist. I think falling into the angelic role might have come easier if Lydia had known that all along. Because RTD also said to Lydia that Jill is not an angel or a saint, whereas that's what he tells the press all the time.
Like now the virus has entered our house. I think what like Russell really wanted from that mug moment was just like the paranoia that we all have and the humanness that we all have. Like, Jill is not an angel. She was listening to all these rumours and she didn't know what was true, and she's not a saint and she's not an angel and she's not like, it's good. She didn't know.
I was just going to say that idea of a composite and taking, maybe what RTD is like now and putting it in the past, it's like that idea of maybe she represents how RTD wishes more people would have acted in back then,
Yeah.
and kind of that I sort of idealized role.
The big Jill thing I find really interesting. So at the start of this episode, before it moves into 1984, when we're still at Christmas time 1983, we have Tozer and
Baxter.
Tozer and Baxter
Slash
singing
Baxter and Tozer.
Yeah, on the Isle of Wight with Epso or Clive or Richie's dad, whatever you want to call him, and Richie's mum Valerie watching, and they're singing, a lovely love song. And so after the performance, Valerie, Richie's mum, is all like, "Oh, you're very welcome to stay. Richie really loves you. The acting is real. You're singing a love song. Good acting is when it's true. I can tell you love him." And I feel like the dominant takeaway you'd probably get from this is like, oh, Richie is gay. The mum is being so silly and such a boomer, reading into this kind of thing. How silly that she doesn't understand her son or this relationship here. I think it's a little more complicated than that. And so does Lydia West, because she said,
Well, Jill has a loyalty to Richie to kind of keep his secret. But I think somewhere deep down in Jill, she actually would love for that to be.
You'd be such a power couple.
and I think there is a kind of, at least from her end, a kind of quasi, I don't know if heteronormative's the right word, but a kind of quasi relationship going on there. I mean, in the first episode, she leaps at seeing a guy check out Ash, and she leaps to go make friends with him and immediately try and hook him up with Ash. And then she takes on that mothering, nurturing role like super, super quickly. It's like her compulsion is to do this. And then she is constantly going with Richie to, the Isle of Wight. She doesn't have to go there around Christmas time. He's her friend and everything. But I feel like there's something fascinating there that maybe Valerie is picking up on, if not from the son's end, from Jill's end. What do you guys think of that?
Are you going to use that word that I didn't know until you said it the other day? Or will it remain unsaid?
I was using the word Fujoshi to talk about...
The hell? Oh, God, right. Sorry, just pronounced it weirdly. I wonder what the hell you were talking about.
I've never heard it. I've never heard it said. I've only read it. How do you say it?
Just Fujoshi, I think, is closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's almost like she's collecting gay men. She lives with gay men. The series started with her trying to hook two gay men up together.
Yeah.
I love Jill. She's a great character. I just think she's more interesting because I don't just think she's a stereotype of this angelic mother who just wants to make people happy. She's a great person and she does make people happy. I'm not trying to take away from any of that. I'm just saying I think there's more to her character and to her psyche than just pure, I just want to take care of everyone and make everyone happy. I don't think there's any selfishness. I'm not meaning to imply that at all. I just feel like her psychology and maybe her sexuality is a little more deep and that she's not just a one-dimensional character. But what do you guys think of all this stuff I'm throwing around?
I think it is very realistic for a woman and to be very good friends with a gay man and also maybe sort of deep down sort of have complicated maybe feelings at some point towards that gay man. And yes, I am speaking from experience, and it's like I think the nuance and the kind of the complicatedness there and the fact it's not easily classifiable as one thing or another, and maybe there's implications or subtle things. I think it just makes it feel real. I think it's not something you need to sort of put in a box. I think that's a good thing.
I think I know just from TV and also some stories from real life that it's almost like a cliche at this point where someone says why are all the good ones gay? So it's a well-established thing that some women will have a thing for gay men as an idea. I mean, I guess if we're talking about these relationships, I think the only thing that matters is that you don't take it too far. So I've heard stories of people I've known, women who have basically fantasized about men that they know who aren't even gay. And Jill doesn't do anything like that. I think she's just fully supportive, fully, knows where the line is. But yeah, that's sort of my take on it.
She starts the show trying to get Ash and Richie together, and that's a nice thing. They become friends. She's not doing anyone any harm. She's doing the opposite of harm. She's being a lovely person, doing good things for people. I just think it's interesting that I don't feel like it's just she's a stock cliche, one-dimensional. She just does this because she's just kind. And she's based on a real person. Actually, that feels... Yeah. It's very strange to bring the real Jill into it at this point. Taking a step back, She's a lovely, complicated character. Very Russell T Davies, because she feels so real, like Gig said.
Very, very healthy subtext, I think, you know?
Yeah.
And I think RTD not telling Lydia West about the whole like real person link, I think that's a good idea, because at the end of the day, she's a fictional character in the drama. Like the link to the real historical figure is like maybe not the most important thing here. Like I think that the show deserves to have its own characters, and an actor deserves to have their own character to play and put their own spin on it.
And confusing acting with reality is, of course, what Valerie does. She strikes me as like one of those people who thinks that soap operas are real or something.
Well, I have two thoughts. The first is just that the real Jill and the real Russell T Davies both told Lydia that they didn't want her to base her performance on the real Jill.
Approached her at the end of the read through, and I was just like, "Thank you so much for being you," and she was just like, "Oh, stop it." And she's just very lovely and so kind, and I didn't make any of my character choices based on her, but it was just amazing to have someone in the room that lived through this time, and she is how Jill is depicted. That is the real life Jill. She's kind, she's generous, she's very sweet, but she didn't want me to, and Russell didn't want me to base any of my kind of character choices on her, which was so nice, because it just gave me the complete freedom to play Jill as I did, and not kind of try and mimic certain traits of the real life Jill. Not that would be an issue, because she is spectacular.
So that all worked out. But with the mother, with Valerie, Richie's mother, I think Jill's psychology here being more complex than it might immediately seem, I think that's a complicating factor for the mother as well, because I think that makes her potentially a bit less boomer or less mistaken. Obviously, she's mistaken with her son, but the fact she may be picking up on a real kind of infatuation from Jill's end, I think shows that she might not be as completely deluded as we might otherwise take away. Are you guys going to push back on that?
I think it's I mean, obviously, because you could describe what Jill feels for Richie as love, right? Even like, there's more than one form of love at the end of the day, and I think it's not some kind of weird thing that I don't know what I'm saying here. Like, I mean, it could be more that Valerie is kind of putting that love in the expected kind of traditional heteronormative box, like it must be like a romantic love or whatever. But that doesn't mean that the love that she is kind of picking up on from that song isn't there. You know, that's the thing.
I just remembered a great relevant scene. When Jill visits the doctors, which is probably just to try and get information about AIDS, she has this kind of awkward moment where she's like, it's not like I need the pill, to be honest, but you never know, I live in hope. And she kind of laughs self-deprecatingly.
It was interesting, I guess, because it's maybe like the only time where we get any maybe glimpse into Jill thinking about herself rather than kind of thinking about like her gay friends, which is quite interesting. Like the idea that Jill isn't getting any like is kind of, I guess it's like the only kind of outright glance of sort of Jill's own sexuality that we've had so far, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, an interesting thing. This comes out of a scene with Jill. When Jill's talking with Gloria, two characters we've discussed so far, Gloria brings up this anecdote of a production of
Seven Brothers for Seven Brides, yeah.
Seven Brothers for Seven Brides. And he talks about like this rumour of a production where all seven brothers spread HIV between themselves and all died. The whole show comes from this anecdote.
Tiny little line that flies past you. The entire drama came from that. I heard that story around about 1989, or it might have been 1991. I can't date it. And as a joke, it's kind of awful and horribly funny, blackly comic. It's kind of profane at the same time. It just made me think, wow, imagine if there were seven brothers in a cast and they all got wiped out. And that made me think, imagine if you had a flat full of people. It's just one joke that looks like a throwaway moment. I didn't tell David Carlisle, the actor, this. I didn't tell the director this. I didn't want it to have too much weight. But that joke created the entire show.
I think Russell T Davies' clips in that confidential thing, they've found the exact length, so they're like, they pique your curiosity, but he also doesn't say enough. That anyway.
We mentioned that scene with Jill and the doctor, and that doctor who completely shuts down when she brings up AIDS. Like, why would you think I had anything to do with that? What do you mean? I don't understand what you're talking about. And that kind of, I guess that was sort of a running theme with this episode, with with these authority figures kind of not saying like the reality and kind of shutting down rather than confronting reality. Because even with Colin towards the end of the episode, when that woman's telling him with a complete smile on her face that he's, oh, you're not sacked, it's more like you're just not employed anymore. See, yes, go away. I think that thing, and also of course in that scene where Mr. Hart is just looking down at this thing and not even acknowledging that he's given Colin the boot on the basis of some kind of unfair motive. I think it was kind of a real, I guess, and also, sorry, I keep bringing up extra things, but also like Gloria's family not really saying kind of outright kind of what their issue is, like with Jill, and kind of just being like, oh, go away, oh, fuck off. I think that was that real running theme of this episode, with people just not being able to say stuff but shutting down rather than confronting reality.
Can I soapbox related to that now, or do you guys want to?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go for it.
Okay, so on that topic of false authority around HIV or misinformation or denial and things like that, so this episode had a long, glorious sequence, a montage really, where Richie lays out why he does not believe in AIDS, and thus why a whole lot of people back in the 80s would not have believed in it either. It's a really interesting scene in terms of the way it's filmed, the way it's edited, the way it's acted.
Amazing and dissonant, and amazingly dissonant.
Yeah, dissonant, that's the thing. It's that complicated mix of emotions that RTD is very good at. Like, it's funny, but also it's tragic as well.
We'll dig into the formalistic aspects of it a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about the history and viewpoints and skepticism the sequence is speaking to. Because in our discussion of the first episode, we really honed in on the show itself and where the showrunner Russell T Davies was coming from. So in our second discussion, I think it's a good time to put some focus on the subject of the show, HIV and AIDS, and contextualise that too, especially because I'm sure many of us didn't know a lot of this stuff before the show, or before the show might have driven us to look into it further. So the Richie sequence outlines a lot of the beliefs and confusion and skepticism and misunderstandings and context of AIDS at the time in the London gay community. But now, with decades of accumulated knowledge since 1984, we know a lot more about AIDS than Richie or any of his peers did, and obviously this information continues to evolve over time because that's the nature of science, certainly as it's understood in the UK anyway. First, of course, the difference between HIV and AIDS is that HIV is a virus that can potentially attack someone's immune system, and AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome, when HIV has done enough damage to a person that their immune system is so weak that all kinds of malignancies and issues can affect them with a lot more ease than they could someone without AIDS, hence deaths of tuberculosis, tumours, and other opportunistic infections. Because without HIV, someone's body can usually fight off a lot of these type of things, but with HIV, their immune system can be weakened to the point of succumbing to all sorts of issues. And that's why we had that confusion in the first episode with Neil Patrick Harris's Mr. Coltrane character and his partner Juan, because it's not so much the disease that someone with AIDS gets that's the confusion, so much as how and why they uncharacteristically succumb to it at something like their age, which might be far too young for people to normally succumb to that kind of disease, and things like that.
The terminology is you die from AIDS-related complications, I think.
So AIDS was recognised as a new disease in 1981, the year of our first episode, when increasing amounts of gay men kept dying of infections that were taking strangely effective and opportunistic hold in their bodies. But we really have to turn the clock back to understand it. In the very early 1900s, HIV-1M was present in what is now Kinshasa, the capital and largest city of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we know this because of a 1959 blood sample of a man from Kinshasa, because the age of viruses can be extrapolated from comparing viral sequence data in samples. And it's in Kinshasa that many diversified subtypes of HIV were found, indicating that that's where it was already developing and mutating and so on. So scientists can make family trees of virus strains by comparing lots of samples of a virus and then working backwards to assess the originator of a virus, which for HIV they've pegged as the early 1900s. So humans got HIV perhaps around 1908 in Kinshasa. But where did the virus itself come from? As tends to happen with viruses, it was transmitted from a different animal, from primates. Simian, so related to primates, apes. Simian immunodeficiency viruses, SIVs, are in all sorts of sub-Saharan African primates, but they generally don't give rise to disease. And so we don't know the precise way HIV-1M jumped from primates to humans, but we know that it must have been through exposure to ape blood or other bodily fluids, most likely through hunting. bushmeat hunting, probably of chimpanzees. That would provide easy opportunity for chimpanzee blood to get into the cuts and wounds of human hunters, getting into the bloodstream, or the mucous membranes, getting inside. Humans are primates themselves, ourselves rather, so there's genetic similarity. So sometimes a simian immunodeficiency virus would adapt to the human it found itself in and become a human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. So there was HIV in humans in Kinshasa in the early 1900s. But It's a Sin isn't in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's in the 1980s. So what happened? Kinshasa was then, and is now, the largest city in that country. And it's situated along the huge Congo River. Rivers are nexuses of travel and commerce, lots of human interaction. And there's a lot of info and discourse about colonialism and the sex trade and colonialist labour practices enforced on African workers at the time. There's all kinds of heady stuff there, but suffice to say, naturally, cases of HIV spread and grew over time. And isolated cases of HIV spread to countries like the USA actually quite a bit before the 80s, such as in the case of Robert Rayford, a Missouri teenager who tragically died in 1969 at age 16 in what's generally taken as the first known death of AIDS in the USA. But in the episode we're discussing, Richie mentions the ludicrous nature of a disease targeting the letter H, citing Haitian and homosexual people. Not that he would have known, but various Haitian people would have worked in the Democratic Republic of the Congo around 1966, then returned to their home. HIV opportunistically spread this way from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Haiti, and from Haiti to the USA. How did it become an outright epidemic? Why did it seem to target gay men in particular? On our discussion of the first episode, Gig noted how the virus was portrayed like a kind of existential horror. Richie scorns the idea it's sent from God. Roscoe says he hears apocalyptic, religious, judgmental nonsense enough from his father. There's obviously no cosmic or existential or moral reason HIV spread devastatingly through gay men in particular. It just comes down to very material, mechanical reasons. In American cities, such as New York, where we know the virus had begun to naturally spread, it began to spread at a higher rate among male gay communities because, well, how did it spread to humans in the first place? Viruses spreading through bodily fluids, entering the bloodstream or mucous membrane tissue. Well, anal intercourse is relevant in this regard because the rectum's lining is thin, thus HIV can enter through there, and it can enter through the body through the opening of the penis or any possible abrasions on the penis, and potential tearing obviously introduces issues as well. But the social factor, casual sex, lots of it, with lots of sexual partners, would obviously just increase the chance exponentially of coming into contact with someone with HIV. And anal sex was more likely to spread HIV than other forms of sex. And the long incubation rate of HIV, which can be a decade or longer, meant it took time to notice, so it spread. And especially in an increasingly globalized world, English cities are not that different or that far from the cities of the USA, and so it spread in England too. Contrary to what Jill's doctor might have thought in this second episode of It's a Sin, of course HIV applies to women, it can apply to anyone, but vaginal fluid carries less HIV than semen and rectal fluid lining, and anal sex was more prevalent with gay men having sex with men than with men and women having sex, or women and women having sex. And gay men naturally might have had less inclination to use protective condoms than a couple concerned about fertilization. Look at that scene in the first episode where Richie throws the condoms overboard with a smile. And so things panned out the way that they did.
There was just no money going into research for it. That's, part of the reason there was so much ignorance.
And what Russell would say is that scene in question, the Richie montage, is one of the reasons he wanted to write the whole show. And he says it's pivotal because what isn't mentioned enough is that the history of AIDS tends to be written by the activists, which is absolutely right and fair because they were there. And those activists were people like who Tomtit has brought up, Larry Kramer. But most people weren't activists. And in a pre-internet age, a pre-phone age, most of them had no idea what was going on until the mid-80s, or even the mid-90s, RTD says he could argue. So a lot of ignorance was going on. So he wanted to write a speech that was very much his perspective, that, the virus is only affecting groups of people starting with the letter H. That's, ridiculous. That's impossible. RTD remembers himself making that joke, that line, it only affects people beginning with the letter H, because he was too busy being clever and making jokes. And he says if he just used his brain, he could have seen there's a blood link shouting at you with those 3 groups, but he just didn't understand. So what do you guys think of all that?
I think the really interesting thing about the sequence, just on an immediate level, is that it's fun to watch and it feels like a fun performance. It's like, it feels like there's a sense of triumph to Richie in that scene when he's like, hit me with those lasers, please. He's living his best life. He's going around all the guys, having lots of fun. And we get swept up in that fun a little bit. But also the fact that obviously we know he's talking absolute, bloody nonsense. And I think the fact that the structure-wise, the fact that they use techniques like they have him kind of addressing the camera, kind of talking to us, and kind of breaking down reality a little bit. We have the spotlight coming on, we have text overlay on screen, we have montages, we have all these fantasy spots, like he's wearing that Russian hat and stuff. I think it's like that sense of fantasy and of reality breaking down a little bit, and also the artifice of the story being brought to the forefront. I think it's really interesting because he's kind of talking to us through the years, but through this lens of total dramatic irony, I guess.
Yeah, I think with Richie's characterization and with Russell T Davies himself back in the 80s, because he says this was drawing from him, I think the issue with Richie, like Jill points out, is that he's too clever. Because like lots of smart people, he's sharp enough and he's creative enough that I think he can basically synthesize whatever knowledge he wants into whatever meaning he wants. You know the Wikipedia game where you get a random Wikipedia page and the game is you have to find another specific page just by following links you find in successive pages? Like you have to get from One Division to James Dresnock in just 4 links, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
6 degrees of Hitler, I've seen it phrased as.
Yeah, I think a lot of clever people, I think their minds kind of operate this way. They're clever enough to find or to create reasonable links and logic between basically whatever we want. I think us 3, we might see this in the Doctor Who fandom sometimes, where people might contrive reasoned but extremely stretched hot takes to propose certain episodes are hidden masterpieces or things like that. And some public relations practitioners are paid a rather great deal of money to creatively massage actions of certain states or organizations that any reasonable person might think are good or might think are bad into something those publics will then consider the complete opposite way that they might have reacted instinctively because of clever creative reasoning and message making. And that's what RTD identifies Richie as having done here. And that's what Jill kind of hits on toward the end in that conversation with his A-levels not helping him from an actual extant reality of HIV. I just think that's brilliant. I think it's excellent characterization, and I think it's a very realistic trait in intelligent people.
So, the montage, what it reminded me of was a PSA, like an advertisement, with someone addressing the camera and sort of giving us their take on things in an incredibly persuasive, attractive way. But like the insane thing about that is that he is giving us this disinformation about AIDS and how all the theories about it are fake and how it's not real. So in that sense, this is not something you could have put out in the early 1980s because that would have been completely toxic and harmful. So
that's true.
I think RTD has been quite clever in how he's made an AIDS drama that uses hindsight to sort of portray the characters more deeply. And even just the whole very idea of someone like Richie, someone who is a denier, he is the protagonist of this show. I think in 1985 that would have been very difficult to pull off because people like Richie, they are in Larry Kramer's writing, people like Richie are the villains, and Larry Kramer has a lot of vitriol directed at those people, and it's very emotionally driven. But I think now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's sort of safer for a writer like Russell T Davies to look on a redemptive side to those people that, they were just doing their best in a horrible situation and it was just toxic all around. Using these like advertising PSA-like techniques. I'll tell you what it reminded me of. It reminded me of those ads for Doctor Who. Just those Eccleston looking at camera saying, "Do you want to come with me?" It's that total pull of attraction and rhetoric, and RTD has very rarely been that figurative in his writing. I mean, like, this is the guy who hates dream sequences, for Christ's sake.
I love your point of distancing there. I hadn't thought of that, but that, yes, he couldn't have made this in the 90s. He couldn't have put that sequence in something back then. It would have been irresponsible if it even thought of thinking of it that way then.
In fact, in the 90s, he made Clear as Folk, which is like a complete riposte to that idea of being safe. And
I think what that distancing point makes me think of is so interesting. Of course, the show was filmed before the COVID-19 pandemic got serious enough in the UK, at least, to shut down productions or to get mass awareness among the population or anything. That's why we have it at all, that it was filmed so much earlier.
That's on its way. No. We finished filming just before the lockdown. So doing all this, I've actually been working. I've been editing. In fact, today is the final mix of the final mix of the final mix. Today we finish it.
So parallels with COVID-19. After the fact, they're very present, of course. They're unavoidable in how we receive the show, but they're not something that went into the intent of making the show. But that distancing element, I think, allows us to kind of examine the logic of how some discourse around COVID-19 might pop up or might be perceived. And what I'm thinking of here is we get that moment where he talks about, some people say it's a bioweapon, or some people say it's the work of a communist state. And we see how ridiculous that is when we're looking at an 80s epidemic, where we have that distance. And I just think it's an interesting mirror to some discourse, we have now, where we don't have that distance and we're in a much more insular state of reactivity.
Ritchie's, his whole conduct in that scene reminded me of like an anti-Darwinist, just like, when evolutionary theories came out and people would be like, okay, so you're telling me we came from monkeys? Am I really supposed to believe that guff? It was sort of that kind of tone. It was really well written.
In an interview with The Big Issue, Russell T Davies says, speaking of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, we, gay people, finally get equality, we finally get the law on our side, and this disease comes along and kills us. It sounds false. It felt like fake news before we had invented the notion of fake news. And then, of course, you are joined by this holy choir of, especially American, evangelicals saying it is sent by God to kill you, which you are denying even as people are dying all around you.
Yeah, it's so incredibly easy to phrase something that is true and is real as something that sounds absurd. It's like it's total sophistry. And although I think the thing that I think maybe separates this from the COVID stuff is that I feel these days, like the COVID denialism that exists now is extremely politically charged. I think like a huge amount of it forms in this resurgent kind of Red Scare, kind of communist paranoia, and kind of also this kind of like conservative kind of reactionary stuff, and that sort of anti-government kind of vitriol combined with sort of like the, I don't know, all kind of crazy like QAnon shit. Like it's like it feels like almost this won't necessarily cut through to COVID denying people, because that whole thing is just such a bigger kettle of fish kind of bearing down on people that kind of leads them to believe all these crazy ass conspiracies.
Yeah.
I think the difference here, and I feel like Russell has phrased it similarly at some point, it's that the transmission of data now means narratives can be rallied up so much quicker and spread with so much more efficiency. Back then, like we see with Jill getting Colin to get those papers, it was so scattered and so hard to get information, which means it's harder for the real information to spread. But in a way, it also means it's harder for the misinformation to spread, because it's harder for it to shore up, a super coherent narrative that can then spread infectiously among a great deal of people. That's why we have Ritchie saying all these nonsensical counter narratives that are untrue at once. And it's like the mere amount of them is kind of a nullifying factor, where I think that's less of a factor now, where narratives can kind of glom together super quickly and get very grand in scope very quickly because of how they can be disseminated so quickly and effectively now.
Another lift from Kramer, by the way. In his article, he goes through all the theories, and a lot of them are repeated in Ritchie's monologue. There are a few that aren't. Like in The Normal Heart, a character has a breakdown basically based on the fact that he heard a theory that it's like malignant waves from the planet Uranus. So not all of them were covered, but there were like so many just nonsense theories. And also the questionnaire that Gloria talks about, where they ask him if he had sex with animals, that's from the Kramer article, which is like the questionnaire sort of alienating and dehumanizing the people who took it. It distorted the data so much that, like, because when you have someone answering a questionnaire, you know, in a climate of like shame and feeling like they're being pointed at, then yeah, no legitimate statistical research can come from that.
Tom, you've barely mentioned music. Do you want to talk about any of the needle drops?
I'm not sure I have much to say about it this week. I mean, the score continues to be great, and the credits music this week was like bitterly ironic. It's that disco song Gloria that stung, and Joy Division as well is sort of an unconventional pick. You know, it's not something that really gets recognized as like a disco type song. But I mean, it is. It has that disco beat.
Yeah. And
obviously very pertinent to the themes of the show. But yeah, I continue to be impressed with the music choices. Oh, and Kids in America as well. That's one that's like such a stock Hollywood. Oh, we have a kid in America. Let's play Kids in America. But because Colin is so innocent, it really matched his temperament, I thought. Yeah. Great music still.
This is unrelated to music. I just remembered it because I was thinking of the song that plays in the Richie Smartass sequence, and it reminded me of something, that the kind of criticism of intelligence that's going on here, like how Jill criticizes Richie so smart that he can in fact reason himself out of the truth or actual logic because he's so creative. I think it's something present in a lot of RTD stuff. I remember the 10th Doctor in particular. I'm thinking of episodes like Midnight, for example, where RTD seems to have like this towering criticism of the Doctor is so smart and he's so intelligent and he's such a creative mind that it actually gets himself into trouble because he's at such an elevated level of thinking that he kind of lifts off the ground of how people, or what the actual material reality or the social reality of a situation is. So I think it's interesting that it's something Russell works with a lot, perhaps because he identifies it in himself, because after all, the Richie H thing, you know, came from him.
Just one more thing on the briefly go back to the music front for a minute. I noticed a lot of this episode that RTD is really enjoying abruptly cutting off a song in the midst of its kind of height. Like that scene where Colin suddenly gets interrupted by Mr. Hart kind of barging back into his room with wine and stuff, which was, oh God, so horrific.
Oh, yeah.
I think Mr. Hart, I think it reminds me of how well RTD can sketch a monster with just a few strokes. Like the fact that Mr. Hart, like, he doesn't, like, just the fact that he kind of gives Colin the boot from his job and then doesn't say anything about it, and that cowardice, I think immediately just makes us, we really just loathe him because he's such a predator and just such a kind of horrific entity. It was just really effective stuff.
Cutting off the music is a really great device because, like, cutting off Murray Gold is frankly the greatest crime known to man. And as soon as Murray Gold stops playing, I become uncomfortable. So yeah, it is like a Pavlovian. It just works every time.
We haven't talked about the Roscoe stuff, like, in his sister. Oh, yeah. Like, it was interesting, they mentioned how just the sheer depth of depression that their dad has gotten into over the fact that one of his children got pregnant and the other one's gay. It's kind of interesting because it's sort of that question of what degree of responsibility does, or perhaps, like, do the children feel or ought to feel over kind of the state that their parents have got themselves into. It's kind of interesting. Like, Roscoe dismisses his dad, like, oh, good riddance, but he's still giving money to his mum and stuff at the end. So it's kind of, I thought there wasn't a huge amount of Roscoe stuff in this episode, but it was a nice little note to include in there.
And Stella being spelt with an R is just one of those really eccentric Russell touches that I enjoyed.
Just one last little thing. I thought it was quite effective how they used people gradually joining the other faction in the pub, like Jill first, and then Ash joins as well, just to show how this shift in kind of awareness and knowledge is kind of maybe putting a bit of a divide between the friend group. It was kind of very very effective way of showing that. I think generally the show is just very very good at telling a lot of story with just small touches and a lot at once. You know, just. They just pack a huge amount in every single episode. Right, if that's all, I'm willing to get booted now. So,
sure.
Great talk, guys. Right, have fun.
Thanks, Gig.
Right, no problem.
And now we move into our second Sin spoiler zone. Gig at this point has only seen the first 2 episodes, hence him only being in the main discussion for this episode, but Tom and I have seen all 5 episodes, so we're going to talk about episode 2 in context of the whole show and the spoilers that abound within it. One thing that struck me is that Colin's infected this whole time, and that adds like such an extra layer of like misery to me in the episode, that he goes to America and he doesn't have sex with anyone, and he comes back and he was infected on the plane there and he was infected on the plane back. It's just adds this doom and misery and tragedy to me in episode 1 as well, but especially in episode 2, where he's living his life more, knowing that he's really on a timer now.
And there's a moment where Roscoe sort of proddingly asks him, like, if he's had sex, is he a virgin? And he just gives this sort of anxious look. And it's because, of course, in hindsight, we know that he's not, which is just heartbreaking. Yeah.
With Richie in episode 3, I mean, we never get it confirmed whether it's his boyfriend from episode 3, Donald, that we never get it confirmed. Like in the last episode, they talk about whether it was Donald that gave him AIDS, because that's, that's more poetic if it was from this guy he kind of loved, his first proper boyfriend who had HIV. If it had spread to him from that, then that's very logical. But it strikes me, because of the long incubation period, it's entirely possible Richie had it earlier. It's possible he, like Colin, is walking around, with this sentence of doom upon him already. It's just rewatching these earlier episodes after having seen the whole show, I get this grim atmosphere now, thinking, oh, their lives are going to be so tragically cut short, and it could be from something already in them. Like at the start, when the Isle of Wight guy refuses to have sex with him, that really might have been the right call.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like none of those people ever did have a way of knowing for sure, you know, who they got it from. So yeah, that atmosphere of doubt is totally true to life.
I think it adds a whole extra layer of dramatic irony to the HIV denial montage. We talked about that Richie's denying what's going to kill him, in episode 5. It just makes it all the more sad to me.
I guess one thing that stuck out to me was the sort of very last scene of the episode, Gloria's parents sort of having a bonfire of all the records of his friends and the letters and everything. It's a really grim foreshadowing of kind of what happens to Richie at the end.
Yeah.
Except because Gloria's dad is quite frightening. You kind of like, the moment you see him, you kind of expect that he's not going to take this well. But Richie's parents, because they're so just sort of suburbanite, you don't think that they're going to be that sort of barbaric and hold back the letters and everything, but of course they do. So yeah, that was some pretty grim foreshadowing going on there.
With Richie's parents, of course this will come more to the fore when we discuss episode 5, but I was struck again by how the dad is set up as the antagonistic figure and the ridiculous figure. But we know in episode 5, for better or worse, he's positioned much more sympathetically. It struck me that he's right about Barry Manilow, where Valerie is not right. And it's this hindsight thing of, we can't predict how these characters are going to end up when we, watched episode 2 for the first time. But it's interesting just to see that we'll end up sympathizing with and possibly liking Clive more because of how he treats his son in the end, which is less antagonistic than we'd expect from how he's giving him a hard time here. Whereas Valerie, who's much more gentle and trying to, make sure he's set up with this nice girl, turns out to be that figure who kind of treats him like Gloria was treated by his family, like you were talking about, with the kind of getting rid of the traces of your friends and things like that. So it's just interesting how the show is quite subtly, because we don't get many scenes with Richie's parents early on, but it really is setting up these templates with them that it can then subvert towards the end.
With that thing of Clive correctly identifying Barry Manilow as gay, it's sort of like, when what Gig said about Roscoe's dad sort of falling into depression, it sort of struck me that like RTD might be establishing a kind of framework where like denial is the absolute worst reaction you can have, because obviously Valerie exists in a state of complete denial, but Roscoe's dad, he is like absolutely crestfallen about it, but he eventually sort of comes back from that and finds some decent level of humanity, and Clive, who is very, let's say, forthcoming with his emotions, eventually finds a way to find that common humanity. So it's like, I think RTD is kind of positioning expressing your emotions as a better pathway to, becoming a better person. So I thought it was interesting in that way, but I'm still not ready to redeem Clive. He has a lot to answer for. That's no doubt in my mind.
That point on denial versus openness with emotions is really interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that way. That squares up with Clive's antagonistic tendencies really well. That kind of maps onto how he's kind of redeemed or attempted to be in the narrative really interestingly. I'll be thinking about that a lot when we eventually move in episode 5. And the next discussion is going to be a tougher one as the show gets a lot more serious, because while Gloria was nice and all, it's a lot more brutal who passes in the next episode. So
yes, I'm not looking forward to reliving it, to be honest.
That'll be an interesting discussion.